Welcome to your Trust Your Ecosystem, Confidence and Security, Privacy, Accessibility, and AI. My name is Karen, and I am joined by Dr. Michelle Watt and Kelly Herman. We hope to spend the next 40 minutes or so empowering you to make informed procurement decisions when it comes to assessing your resources in the areas of security, privacy, accessibility, and AI. I'm going to ask Michelle and Kelly to say hello and introduce themselves. Michelle, would you like to start?
Certainly. Thanks, Karen. My name is Michelle Watt. I'm the Chief Systems Officer of the Scottsdale Unified School District here in Scottsdale, Arizona. We are a K-12 school district. We have over 20,000 students and serve not just the city of Scottsdale, but some students in Paradise Valley and Phoenix as well.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kelly Herman. I am the Vice President of Accessibility, Equity, and Inclusion for the University of Phoenix. You likely have heard of the University of Phoenix before. We have almost 80,000 students, and we offer our students, associates, bachelor's, and master's and doctoral degrees. So we work with a lot of students over, from various different backgrounds, and, we do a lot of procurement. So we're really excited to be able to share some of that experience with you today with Michelle and Karen. So Karen, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, ladies. And just for the audience, Scottsdale and University of Phoenix are both members of One EdTech. I am on staff at One EdTech. I work with our K-12 districts. One EdTech is a very unique organization that brings K-12, higher ed, and our supplier partners together in the development and the implementation of EdTech standards. So as members, both Michelle and Kelly have had tremendous input into the work of One EdTech in the areas of security, privacy, accessibility, and AI. And we're excited to hear from them today as they share their experiences, both from a K-12 perspective, as well as that higher ed perspective in all of these areas. But before we hear from them, I would like to all of us think about our current ecosystem, that digital ecosystem. We know that EdTech is rapidly evolving, and the options for our classrooms, our schools, our universities are very overwhelming, and a critical task that we have when selecting the right EdTech application. It often feels like a maze for us. There's countless options available, promising all their unique features and their unique benefits. But we all know that beyond that basic functionality of each application, we have to consider crucial factors like those that we're talking about today: student data privacy, accessibility standards, and the security measures. And then on top of all of that, we must ensure that these applications integrate seamlessly into our existing technology. So many levels of complexity. So because of these layers of complexity, there are very important questions that we must ask ourselves. These critical questions are very important when we're procuring EdTech applications for all learners. And here's what we're going to talk about today. Privacy. How is student data protected and used when using this application? When looking at an application, think about accessibility. Can all students, regardless of their abilities, use the tool effectively? Security. What measures are in place to prevent data breaches? And AI considerations. How is AI implemented and governed in this particular tool? We are so excited to have Michelle and Kelly with us today to share their perspectives in all of these areas and their expertise in privacy, accessibility, security, and AI. To start us off, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to talk with us about privacy.
Thank you. Yes, this is a very important question that we ask ourselves whenever we're thinking about using a tool. And when we talk about procuring, yes, that can be a process where we're actually purchasing and investing in a tool to use in our environment. But we also have to consider how student data is protected and used in those free tools that are used either, whether it be broadly or just as what we might call an ancillary curriculum or tool in maybe even a single classroom. So we need to develop both a privacy culture and processes in our organization. So I want to start by talking about the different types of data that we have in an organization. Some of the data in our organization is what we would consider public data. For example, we may share publicly how the aggregate of our state test results compare with the aggregate average across the state to give our public an idea of how Scottsdale Unified School District is serving our students. That data, while it's calculated using a lot of confidential data, is calculated in a way that is protecting privacy and so can be public. We also have what we call directory information. So this is information like student name, email address, what grade they might be in, that can be released to certain types of partners under certain conditions as part of directory information. And for that, we let parents know in the student code of conduct every year what data classifications are part of directory information, under what circumstances we might release that to partners, and they even have the opportunity to opt out of that. Then we have confidential data. Things like educational records, birth dates, and that type of information is the most sensitive, and that is also the type of information that may be shared with in an EdTech tool with a partner or supplier. So when thinking about those types of data, we need our staff to be aware that when you choose a tool to use with students and encourage them to click sign in with Google, that is an act of sharing some data. Maybe it's just directory information that's being shared. It may be more confidential information being shared, but we always need to be evaluating the safety of that tool and if it is okay to share that information with them. So in Scottsdale Unified School District, we have a collaborative process to review and either approve or deny that data sharing with any tool. It can be a Chrome extension that an individual classroom or teacher is interested in using, all the way up to a procurement process that's formalized for something as big and central to our organization as a student information system. Our process has to be able to be flexible enough for all of these cases, and so that we're cataloging who we're sharing data with and that we have vetted those partners through our process. Our most important partners in this are our partners in teaching and learning, because they bring that perspective of, is this tool valuable in helping us meet our learning goals? Or is there another tool that we've already vetted that is our preferred tool because maybe this is a curriculum resource that we've put a lot of training and support behind, and we'd rather that people use that tool. So if we're saying no to the use of a tool, it may not be because of privacy considerations. It may just be that we're trying to optimize our resources and ensure that we're making the best use of the ones we've selected to invest in. But we also do vet that from a privacy perspective. And there are some tools or resources I'll share that can help you with that process. Part of that process for us is asking the vendor to engage in a data sharing agreement with us. And we rely on the National Student Data Privacy Consortium and the data privacy agreement that they've come up with for that process. And then we make those signed agreements available to the public for that level of transparency. So we need not only the teachers and staff within our organization to be able to access information about which applications have been vetted and are approved for use by both our teaching and learning and our technology teams, but we also want the members of our public to have that transparency and know, where are we sharing data and what agreements do we have in place to protect the data that's being shared there. We really couldn't, in this day and age, complete our mission of educating students without using digital technologies and the valuable resources and capabilities that come to us from our partners, but have that responsibility of vetting them and making sure that they comply with our expectations. So before we shared the resources, I wonder, Kelly, what does that look like from the higher education perspective?
Thanks, Michelle. I think it looks, pretty similar because, we likewise are, concerned about, the types of data that we collect on students and then how it gets, shared with students. And sometimes in higher education, it's, a transition moment for a lot of our students and parents coming from the K through 12 environment to the higher ed environment. And some of those early conversations with parents, especially about the fact that their student is now considered an adult under the law. And, we have to treat them as such. And so sometimes that can be a little bit of a tricky conversation to have. But when we're looking at procuring, software, tools, products, anything that we're going to be doing data, there's a few things that we look for as well, which is how that data is going to come together and allow us to sync that with other data that we might have on the students so that we can get a full picture of how our students are doing. It's really important for us to be able to look at the types of data that you can get about student interactions, about how they're submitting assignments, how they are actually doing on those assignments, and to be able to not only take that information and understand what it's being used, for, but also how it can be able to help us improve our processes, which is a really important part of it as well. So I think, for higher ed, one of the bigger differences is, this whole notion of, getting students used to what kind of data exists on them and how it can be used, and, allowing them to understand more about where their rights are with data, as well as, thinking about the procurement process and how we are, protecting that information about the student.
Thank you. So a few of the resources that we'll share in the chat for you to check out if they seem valuable to you. Common Sense Media privacy ratings. These are high-level privacy ratings from a trusted third-party source that are visible and viewable to anyone available on their website. So that's a great starting place and something that you can encourage anyone to take a look at if they're considering using a tool. Another process that we rely on here in Scottsdale Unified School District is the One EdTech Trusted Apps Management Suite. And we are, because as members of One EdTech, we have access to the vetted actual data privacy policies of organizations. So we can clearly and quickly get an overview of if we expect that this partner already has some default policies and practices clearly described that are going to work for us, or if there might be some hurdles in coming to an agreement with this organization. And then the Student Data Privacy Consortium is one of the options for a data sharing agreement that is standard. It's broad enough to work with many of the state, individual state expectations. There are also state level consortiums that your state may be a part of already with some more customized language for each state. All right, so now I'll turn it back over to Kelly to talk about accessibility.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So I think one of the things that I want to kind of, highlight for our attendees this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you sit, both Michelle and I are in Arizona, so we're on Pacific time, so it's still morning for us. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight is these topics. We're going to give you a quick overview of these topics. These are things that we could actually spend hours talking about and working through the nuances. So, we're trying to give you some of the high points and some of the foundational principles that we want you to take away from this, but know that there is a lot more information than what is actually possible for us to share with you during this session. But I wanted to start off by making sure that we all understand a common definition of accessibility, because accessibility, when we say it like that, sometimes folks do, understand that it is digital accessibility, the ways in which we want our, content, our digital content, our web pages and resources to actually work for individuals who have disabilities who might be using assistive technology. But accessibility is also used in different definitions as well, in terms of how folks can access, resources, whether they have access to broadband internet, whether they, have, the resources to be able to go out and to procure for themselves some of these tools. So it's important that you know that what we're talking about here this morning is that concept of digital accessibility. And what we're really looking to do is to ensure that the technology that we're using allows individuals, regardless of their ability, regardless of diagnosis, to actually independently use the tools that we are putting into our classrooms, that we're offering as resources for our students, in a way that allows them to be independent and to have equal access. And those are really important concepts in the work that we do in terms of making sure that the students are able to get the content that they need, kind of learn what they're supposed to learn, meet those learning objectives, and then also be able to demonstrate that learning. So I wanted to make sure that we started from that perspective. And it's really important to understand that accessibility is a journey. It is not a destination. And I think sometimes this is an area where folks are like, oh, well, I got that, documentation on accessibility. I asked about this during our procurement process. They met, the accessibility standards we were looking at. So I'm good. Well, here's the thing. Every time that a product gets touched, there's an opportunity to make it better and to improve upon, the user experience for the student. But there's also an opportunity to make it worse. And it's something that we talk about a lot, at the University of Phoenix, as we are partnering with our educational technology providers, to make sure that they are building accessibility into what it is that they're doing with their products. And that is a really, really important aspect of this. And I recognize that a lot of you who are joining us today, likely like Michelle, are working at a K-12 organization. You're working in the public school system. And you may have heard, that the Department of Justice recently released web accessibility rules for Title II of the ADA. And there are 5 titles to the ADA. The first 3 are the ones that we commonly talk about. Title I is employment. Title II, private institutions and places of public accommodations, is one aspect of this, but the Title II regs actually apply to state and local government, which means that your educational institution, if you are in the K-12 system or you are at a state publicly funded institution of higher education, those web accessibility rules will apply to you in either 2 or 3 years, depending on the size of your municipality drawing your students from. So it's an important thing to be thinking about now, even though there's a little bit of a runway before the rules are actually implemented and effective, because there is a likelihood that you are looking at technology and you're signing contracts and you're entering into agreements now that are going to be still intact when the web accessibility rules are actually implemented in either April of 2026 or April of 2027. So that's why this is a really important conversation to have right now. So we want to make sure that when you are looking at accessibility vetting, that you are working towards independent, equal access to the educational technology. We also want to make sure that we're promoting inclusivity and diversity in education. And the thing that's really cool about accessibility that I think sometimes folks don't always understand is that it does promote and increase the usability of educational technology tools for all users. It's not just something for individuals with disabilities, to be able to benefit from. There are lots of use cases where folks who have hearing that is not impaired actually benefit from closed captions. And you likely have used them yourself. I mean, I know I use them when I'm at the gym, or if I, am trying to watch something on my phone because my husband's watching football and I don't care about football, I'll throw captions on. So, those are just, that's a quick example, but it's something that I want you to, be mindful of. So I was really fortunate to lead the accessibility task force for One EdTech, and we developed an accessibility rubric that we published last year or earlier this year, and it is part of the One EdTech Trusted Apps, suite of tools. And so it's a self-evaluation tool about the accessibility of a product and the organization's commitment to accessibility. This was something that was really important to us on the task force, and our task force was comprised of members from K-12, from higher education, and from the vendor community, which was a really important aspect of what it was that we were trying to do. Because there is a lot of information out there. The W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, they put forward the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is really, and you may have heard it referred to as WCAG. that is the gold standard in digital accessibility. And we didn't want to replicate those rules or in some way, try to say that we could do it better. Because, when you have an international standard that is, widely accepted, that you should be supporting those standards. But we recognize that evaluation of accessibility is often bigger and includes more things than just the digital standards, just the web accessibility standards. So we wanted to ensure that what we were building as a rubric was going to be able to share the knowledge that we had among the One EdTech member community, but also be able to help member organizations that are putting products out for sale and for consumption, was going to be able to, kind of fill in some of the gaps around the accessibility experience that wouldn't be captured by the actual standards themselves. And so it is really a maturity model, and it is encouraging our suppliers to develop that organizational maturity, as well as enabling accessible EdTech tools for all learners, because what's really important is that the way that the ADA and Section 504 work as it applies to institutions of education, whether it's higher education or K through 12, is that we have the requirements ourselves as the organization, and that affects how we choose to purchase the things that we use, and that in turn is how we get the attention of the vendor community, and so that's a really important component of it. So on the slide, there is a link here to the rubric, and the rubric is publicly available on the One EdTech website. So you can look and see at what we are asking the suppliers to rate their products on. If your organization is a member of One EdTech, you can be able to log in and see the completed rubrics. And so I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that. But these are the categories that we included as part of our rubric. We wanted to know what sort of information and documentation the vendor could provide about the accessibility of the tool. So this is not only asking whether or not the supplier has completed the accessibility conformance documentation, which is a completed voluntary product accessibility template, but also what is included in their roadmaps. How are they building the accessibility into their product development? We also, have some questions and categories here within the rubric about the procurement process and the communication with the supplier. So we want to make sure that, there are certain things that I know, having worked with hundreds and thousands of vendors at this point, that give me more comfort than, make me more concerned. And we wanted to capture those things. So things like, did the demo include information about the accessibility features of the product and the tool. So those are some of the things that we ask about. We also obviously do ask a little bit about accessibility conformance. That's not included within the WCAG standards. And then also a really important component here is alternatives and accommodations. I worked with thousands of students with disabilities across my career, and I can tell you that no one product is going to work for every user. There's a lot, that goes into, especially for us in higher education, when you're working with a student who maybe did not go through formal schooling before with a disability, got injured as an adult, and is now coming back to higher education and using accommodations for the first time. Even the most beautifully designed product can sometimes not work for that student. And so we wanted to know how prepared the actual vendor was to jump into that pool and swim along with us and help us to identify what those alternatives and accommodation processes could be. So Michelle, that's what I wanted to cover. I don't know if you want to add anything from your perspective, from Scottsdale and what we wanted, anything that our K through 12 audience would consider.
Again, there's a lot of similarities there, and I love the way that you expanded on how putting some of these practices and tools in place that make it easier for products to be accessible help all of us. A couple of the things that, or one of the strategies that we implement is to really try and listen when students are asking for things. And I don't know the status of if a student has an accessibility need or not, but we recently had a student reach out and talk about a Chrome extension that would make creating math equations easier for them, and we're able to research and put that in place. And then just this week I received a explanation from a student about how much dark mode would be beneficial to them, and the challenges of only being able to dim their screen. So that's something else that we can look into. So I think if we're in a role to be a decision maker about what things what products are available or how our systems are configured, being open to listening to feedback from the people using those systems and products is really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I love that, you have those examples from the students and how students are advocating for themselves. I think that's such an important part of the students, journey with accessibility, because, when they can leave K through 12, they're going to have to start advocating for themselves in higher ed. And that's usually a kind of a steep learning curve for them. So I love that example. So thanks for that. And I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk about privacy. I'm sorry, security.
Yes. So an important question to ask when we're looking at the products that we might be sharing data with or allowing our users to log into using our credentials is what measures are in place to prevent data breaches. And I brought along this photo that I think once I explain it might be familiar to others in the audience today. This is the physical security that we had in place as recently as 4 or 5 years ago to protect the confidentiality of state assessments. So we used to receive pallets of assessments on paper that our students would take, and that was something that needed a lot of security around it to protect the validity of those assessments. We know since that cage was empty for a few years, we were able to tear down that part of the warehouse, and all of our assessments are digital now. So we were able to reclaim that space for something else. But without the ability to use physical security to protect systems and data, we really need both a partnership from humans and technology. They're both part of the security solution. So cybersecurity training is very important. I think we can all relate to receiving maybe a simulated phishing email, going through a mandatory training about the value of having a long passphrase versus just a short and not complex password, why we might have MFA implemented. Those tools and that training are useful not only in the organization where we serve, but in our personal lives as well. So helping people understand the how and the why behind some of our cybersecurity practices and the role they play in keeping our systems and data safe is an important part of our security strategy. Access controls are also important. When we are evaluating solutions, digital solutions to bring into our environment, one of our default questions is what level of access they provide. We recently were looking to bring a solution on board that only had a complete admin level role. And the reason we were able to agree to use them is that they were really close on their roadmap at that time to having those separate access controls so that we could give access to a principal to be able to see just the information for their school, and a district administrator to be able to view information but maybe not change settings because that wasn't part of their role. So evaluating the controls that are available in a solution, and then of course implementing the solution in a way that matches the environment so that the right people have access to do what they need to do, but that people don't have more access than they need is another important part of security. Looking at data encryption is also important. I know, when you're logging into your bank, you want to make sure that you're using that HTTPS protocol that encrypts the data that's being transmitted over the internet. We also have VPN solutions in place and other ways to make sure that data is encrypted either at rest or in transmission so that we're protecting that data. With network security, I mentioned MFA, and that's becoming much more common, including in K-12. Just a few years ago, it actually wasn't common in K-12 to have MFA in place. And it was pretty, we were fortunate in Arizona that when Scottsdale made the move to implement multi-factor authentication for all of our staff members, it was at the same time that most other school districts were as well, because there's a percentage of our staff who've only ever worked in K-12, and this was very new to them, and it represented a big change. So That's one example of how we are securing our networks from intrusion. Also evaluating the vendors that we're partnering with. I spoke a little bit about how we look at the privacy practices of some of our vendors. We also have an obligation to evaluate their security. So while we're focused on making sure that we have things in place like air-gapped backups and cybersecurity training, we need to know what are the practices related to security that our vendor partners have for the data that we're sharing with them, and including the vendors that may actually have access to our systems. So we may have a memorandum of understanding in place with a local government for a way that they're accessing our systems, and need to make sure we're doing that in a secure manner. And then there's audits and monitoring. So what are we doing to check on our own processes and make sure that they're being followed? We also have people who we're grateful, I guess, to for coming in and auditing us. But it is important to be able to answer the questions about, what our password policies are and such in a way that represents the practice of following the best practices in the industry that we have right now. And then with monitoring, there are a lot of advances in the tools being made right now to where we can use machine learning or artificial intelligence to catch changes in the patterns of how our systems or data are being used that humans might not notice. And then those systems can either alert a human to inspect that behavior and see if it's legitimate or not, or those systems can even take action to shut down a behavior, and then by default, and then the human has to say, okay, wait, actually this is an okay thing to be doing once we investigate. So just, I guess the main takeaway here is this idea that it's not just about the technical controls we have in place, it's also about the people that have access to our systems, and mitigating the risk as much as we can. Because if we wanted a completely secure system, we would just turn everything off and not let people log in. But that would not be conducive to meeting the goal of our institution. So we're always looking at how do we mitigate risk, since we cannot completely eliminate it. What else do you want to add, Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think, the one thing that I would add, and actually it just happened to us last week, where we are looking at, enhancing some of the security protocols that we have in place as students are onboarding to the university, and, ensuring that, they are who they say they are, as an institution that serves primarily online students, that's something that's really important to us. Conversation, not just because we had to really look at the digital accessibility of the interface that our students would be interacting with, but also what it was going to mean for students who had very physical disabilities, who maybe couldn't actually do the tasks that would be required of them to verify who they were. And so it was an exciting conversation to be part of, because usually it's one of those things of, oh gosh, we haven't even thought about that. Don't come at me with that. I was only focused on the interface and the accessibility guidelines. But to hear that this particular vendor had also thought about the different needs that folks might have to interact with the tool, and how we could accommodate folks who might need that was pretty exciting. But from a higher education standpoint, I think we all have experienced the similar things, with I think the exception maybe, at least in my employment tenure, the warehouse with the physical security components. But I think that these things are all really important, because as we have gotten more sophisticated with the way that we use the technology, that means the human beings that want to do things that are not in their best interests or in our best interests, have also gotten more sophisticated. So it's not something that you can sit back and just kind of rely on that things are going to be remain status quo. So I think the other aspect that I would add to this is that we have courses for our students, even across higher ed, about what this means, and how to we worked on a course a few years ago in ethical hacking, and what that would look like, so trying to make sure that our students are trained on these things, so that they can become really good professionals when they get out there into the world of work, is pretty cool.
That's excellent, and a great place to start if you are just starting in raising awareness or continuing to raise awareness with both staff and students is that October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And one of the valuable toolkits that's out there is the CISA toolkit that we'll be sharing a link with. And then similar to the accessibility rubric, One EdTech provides a rubric for suppliers to complete that evaluates their security practices. So that is a useful resource in determining what's important to look at as far as the security practices of a supplier partner, and how are the specific suppliers we're interested in performing on their security. Right, let's transition now to talk about AI.
Everyone's favorite topic, right? So, what we're going to just kind of scratch the surface of AI in this conversation, because we don't have a ton of time to be able to go really deep into it. But I think, what we wanted to focus on today was really to think about how artificial intelligence is being implemented in school. And so there's some, things I think, when we start talking about it at the university, and I've had conversations with other colleagues about how they're talking about it within their organizations, you're kind of thinking about it in terms of inputs and outputs. So for us, for input, one of the things that we think about is, does the use of AI facilitate the use of the tool? So are there ways that our students can use AI and to be able to actually use the tool and to be able to meet those learning objectives of the course as they're interacting with it? And a really big part of any conversation around AI, I think, has to include what bias exists in the source material. So we know that AI is pulling from information that is available out there, and that exists now. And we also know that that means that that information may be, from a really long time ago when we had some outdated notions about representation and the ways in which individuals developed and grew, and what their capabilities were, to now having a little bit more knowledge and modern thinking about the way that people have had limited access to opportunities, which may have influenced their performance. So those are important things that you need to understand in terms of the input as you're thinking about using AI. And I also think a really big conversation, that we've been having at the university has been that where is that line between the user completing the task versus the tool completing the task? And then follow up, when does that matter? I think we have to be, mindful, and we have this conversation with faculty a lot, where, the technology is rapidly changing. And sometimes we as human beings like to kind of hold on to what it is that we used to, do before. And therefore, we don't want to adopt these new things because it's unfamiliar to us and we have to learn it. But with AI, it's one of those things where you absolutely have to kind of be willing to change and learn and grow yourselves, because the ways that we used to do things isn't going to necessarily be the best way to teach students how to do it moving into the future. And I think it's important that our students need to understand that and have some exposure to that in their education. And then when you look at it from an output perspective, and I think this is where I've been pulled into, a lot of the conversations, because artificial intelligence has been a tool that has been increased our built environment for individuals with disabilities for a really long time. And so, but how can generative AI facilitate the learning process for users? I think it's really important, and this goes with the next question: what is considered the user's work product versus the tool's work product? And how do you tell the difference? And do you really need to be able to see what was generated with AI versus what the human being actually sat at the keyboard and wrote themselves? Or is it more about the looking at the assignment as a whole, and how they're demonstrating that they've actually met the learning objectives for that course or that assignment? Those are the important considerations, and I think you have to look at AI as one of the tools in your toolbox. And again, are we teaching our users how to use it appropriately to enhance their learning? I don't know that we've quite gotten there, because I think everyone is rushing to say, oh my gosh, I got to use AI and I got to figure out, I got to bring this in, and this tool uses AI, so that must mean it's great. But really what you need to be, able to determine is, what are you asking your students to do? How are you needing your students to do it? And then how can this tool, help facilitate that? And then a couple of other considerations for AI. As I mentioned, just a minute or so ago, AI has increased usability for many disabled people. The ability to search for information, get assistance with multiple tasks, and manage reminders and other information is inherently accommodating for people with many different diagnoses and disabilities. And I think about, my folks that I know in my life, who maybe, are a little bit more limited in their mobility and don't necessarily always have the dexterity maybe to work with a kitchen timer, and you can use your voice assistants in your home and set a timer just by using your voice. Well, that's a game changer for a lot of folks with disabilities. I think about some of the ways in which you can use apps and other, tools through the voice assistants or on your phone to help manage, the things that you have to do and help you schedule the appropriate amount of time to do those. Those are things that we used to spend a lot of time coaching our students on how to, implement those strategies that now the tool, can do it for them in a matter of seconds and, allow them to spend more of that, what I would call their dollar time on the dollar task instead of the penny task. So that's a really important consideration. And I think we have to, as a result of that, carefully consider and manage the use of the tool without restricting appropriate use, right? We can't just come in and write policies and say, we're not going to use AI at all because we want the students, to be able to demonstrate their own work. They may be demonstrating their own work, and we don't want our policies to inappropriately out someone, with a disability or with, maybe they learned, English as a second language, or maybe there is another thing that is going on that then, they would have to disclose some private detail about themselves, because they're using that tool when they're really using it in a very appropriate way. So I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as, educators. And then also AI is improving and changing at a rapid pace. We need to consider how we stay on top of that, how we are going to write policies and procedures and develop resources for our organizations that are going to allow us to do that. What questions do you need to ask of the vendors that you're potentially exploring through a procurement process about what sort of research they're doing in AI? One of the big things that we've talked about a lot with our vendors is ethical use of AI, not just, are you using AI for the sake of using AI, or are you actually trying to make sure that AI is being used ethically in an educational space, and defining that, and having a joint definition for that as you continue to work on the relationship that you might have with your supplier. So Michelle, I'm going to, I'm sure you have a lot of things that you want to say on this one too, because this is a hot topic right now.
I do. I do want us to have a couple minutes for questions though. So I just want to add, speaking of voice assist and how prevalent that's becoming in many of our applications, I look forward to the day when more of our suppliers have AI capabilities built in. So when we look at the tool we use for students to do their writing, when and how will the power of artificial intelligence be built in a transparent and functional way, so that we're not going to a separate tool when we need these capabilities, but they are appropriately integrated. And so talking with our supplier partners about their roadmaps and what's on the horizon for them in that area is something that we look at as well.
Great. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you for the resources.
Perfect. Thank you, ladies. Wow, a lot of information has been shared. I was trying to drop those resources that were mentioned throughout our discussion over in the attendee chat. But we are also going to be sharing this slide deck with the attendees. So everything should be hyperlinked in there. And then, of course, we'll drop our contact information again for everybody. We are all willing to talk about this. We could talk about all of these areas all day long. So in the areas of privacy, accessibility, security, and artificial intelligence, there are some links there all in one place. And then a few additional ones that were dropped in the chat throughout our conversation. To wrap up our time together, we would love for you guys to jump over to that attendee chat and enter your questions, or drop them in the Q&A. Throughout our time together, we did have a couple come in that I'll get us started with. Just so as we're discussing these, if you have other questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. But to go back, Michelle, when you were speaking about privacy, especially when it comes to K-12, one of the questions came in that said, do you work with vendors or vendor partners that are not vetted in the area of privacy and do not show up in the Trusted Apps Directory, or do you only work with vendors who are vetted and that you know that they are protecting student data privacy there?
That's a really great question.
How do you choose those?
Yeah, one of the advantages of partnering with One EdTech on that is if there's a vendor they have not yet vetted, we can reach out and request that vetting be done. And there's a pretty quick turnaround on that. But I can tell you that if, and this happens on a daily basis almost, someone reaches out and says, hey, have you ever heard of, I have a teacher who wants to use. My quick response to that, because I recognize the expertise the teacher brings to the value that this tool might represent in the learning in their classroom. So I quickly can look at the rubric and it's actually color coded. So I even sometimes send a screenshot and just let the person know, hey, the privacy practices of this organization look good at a first glance. And so I encourage you to initiate our process. Or if it doesn't look good at first glance, I will let them know we might run into some barriers. So you should probably consult the teacher and really think through if this is something you want to pursue, because we might not be able to come to an agreement.
Great, thank you so much. And One EdTech is ecstatic to be able to provide that level of information to our institutional partners. We provide that information so that you can make an informed decision. We're not here to tell you that you must or must not use particular vendor partners, but we want to provide that transparency for you to make an informed decision with your team. Another question that came in, and I'll let Kelly or Michelle take this one. It was around the area of security and funding. Do you feel that you can get the proper funding to employ the tools necessary to protect your environment? And I don't know if this question was specifically talking about online environment or your physical environment, because I know we talked about both human and technology there with security, but funding to procure the tools to protect your environment.
Yeah, I think I can start, Karen, and then turn it over, to Michelle. But I think, the answer to the funding question always is that, it's a balancing act. I think there are many of us who are sitting here, and Michelle, I would bet you would agree with my assessment on this. I wish I had an unlimited budget, to be able to do the things that we need to do. And I know that my colleagues in our security, who work for our information security department would feel the exact same way. And so what you're trying to do is to maximize, the resources that you do have, to be able to, get the best, solution that's going to work at that point in time. And, are there trade-offs? Yes. And I think, that's one of the things that we actually, part of the conversation that we had to have about, this ID verification process with, some of the accessibility needs was, which is the greater risk? And, you're constantly having to balance between those things, to be able to, figure out how can you take limited resources, spread them out around as much as you can, protect as much as you can, and, then be able to be, able to continuously improve upon it. And so, I think it's a question of, is there ever always enough funding? No. I would, just flat out tell you, no, there's never enough funding to be able to do it as effectively as you'd like to do. But I think we get pretty close, in terms of maximizing the resources that we do have.
Great, well put. And yes, we all wish there was more, but it's because of partnerships and networking that we are able to rely on each other that sometimes don't cost us as much money. And that brings the three of us together from the K-12, the higher ed, and then us as a nonprofit consortium, bringing our members together. If you have any questions, again, we'll share our slide deck with you. I did drop our names and contact information there in the chat. We appreciate you being here with us today. Enjoy your time at the rest of the event. Visiting the sponsors in the exhibit hall. There's a link there in the chat for you to jump in there. Reach out, let us know how we can help you, and good luck with building your ecosystem and gaining your confidence in the area of security, privacy, accessibility, and AI. Thank you so much for attending. Bye-bye.